Welcome to Sunday Sermons from the Williamsburg Community Chapel, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 through 21. And I'll read verses 13 through 15 for us now, as we prepare to hear from lead pastor Travis Simone as he kicks off our new sermon series titled, The New Exodus. And when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son."
Since September, we've been studying the biblical theme of exile, its causes, how to lament in the midst of it, where to find hope in our exile, and most recently, how to live faithfully within exile. During the season of Lent, which is the 40-day period of preparation for Easter, at long last, we will get the answer to the most important question for all exiles. How do we get home? Today, I hope to communicate not only Matthew's answer to this question, but I hope I can help you feel the surprise Matthew's original readers felt as he delivered the answer to the question they were all asking. How is it that we get home? In what feels like another life, I was a high school English teacher. And I had a great high school English teacher myself. He inspired me. And so after college, the first thing I did became a high school English teacher. And my favorite lessons with my teacher were when he would teach us Shakespeare. We would always read it aloud in class to help with the language. He goes, "Shakespeare, I love great stories. And Shakespeare tells some great stories." So I knew I wanted to teach my class Hamlet. And I put that in the lesson plan, and I told them from the start, we are going to learn this story. Hamlet's the story of a young prince. He's in line to be king. His father is murdered by his uncle, and then Hamlet is threatened by his uncle and sent into exile. The uncle marries his mother, usurps the throne that rightfully belongs to Hamlet. In exile, Hamlet learns from some eccentric friends. Their names are Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. The father, the murdered father, appears to Hamlet as a ghost to reveal the truth about his murder. And the prince, Hamlet, returns to avenge his father's death and restore the kingdom. And I said, if you'll go with me on this journey to learn this story, as difficult as the language is, at the end of it, we'll have a special day in class and we'll take off and we'll watch a movie. So we embarked on the journey. We got to the end. I said, "You've earned your reward. I'm going to show you the Lion King." And they were all excited. So we sat there and I turned on the Lion King, which is the story of a young prince named Simba. He's in line to be king, but his father is murdered by his uncle. His name's Scar. Scar murders Mufasa. Simba's then threatened by Scar, sent into exile. The uncle Scar marries Simba's mother, usurps the throne that rightfully belongs to him. In exile, the prince, the young prince, learns from some eccentric friends, Timon and Pumbaa. The father appears to his son as a ghost to reveal the truth about his murder, and the prince, Simba, returns to avenge his father's death and to restore his kingdom. And so we showed this movie. It was part of the lesson. They didn't quite realize it. About 3/4 of the way through, a young man named Travis Passanita, nice name. Travis cries out, "This is kind of a lot like Hamlet." And I said, "Exactly." And I hit pause and told them there was one great movie critic who called The Lion King simply Hamlet with fur. And the lesson that I hope to teach the kids in my class is that sometimes the job of a great story is to point you to another story. Sometimes the job of a great story is to point you to a greater story or an even bigger story. See, Matthew intended his gospel to have a similar effect on its original readers. And I want to show you the effect that Matthew hoped to have so we can experience it again today. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 13, there's a man named Joseph, and he leads his family to Egypt in order to escape danger in the land of Israel. In Genesis chapter 45, verse 9, there's another man named Joseph who leads his family to escape the danger of a famine in the land of Israel. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 16, there's a tyrannical king named Herod. He seeks to kill all the male children in Bethlehem. In Exodus 1:16, a tyrannical king Pharaoh seeks to kill all the male Hebrew children in Egypt. In Matthew 2:20, an angel speaks to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." In Exodus 4:19, God says to Moses, "Out of the burning bush, go back to Egypt. For all the men who were seeking your life are dead." And that's actually a direct quote in the old Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. Matthew just lifts that quote and places it right in his gospel. For the men who were seeking your life are dead. I can go on. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 18, Matthew uses a quote from Jeremiah 31:15 to draw his readers' attention to the city of Ramah. Ramah was used by Babylon as a staging area to process and then send the people of Jerusalem into exile. And in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6, the priests and scribes read to King Herod from Micah chapter 5, verse 2, which tells of a long-awaited ruler who will come to rescue God's people from slavery, sin, exile, and death. Let me just give you a brief summary here. There's a journey to Egypt, a king seeking the life of Hebrew boys, a command to go out of Egypt, a painful reminder that the exodus from Egypt devolved into the exile to Babylon, and the mention of the Messiah who would one day rescue God's people and shepherd their journey all the way home. See, at some point, I think Matthew's first readers would stand up and have their own Travis Passanita moment. At some point, somebody had to stand up and shout, "Hey, Matthew is telling Israel's story." Now, if you think that I'm making too much of this, you don't have to go any further than Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, the opening two words of Matthew's gospel. In English, we read the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. In Greek, it's two words, biblos, geneseos. And that even kind of comes across in English, biblos, geneseos. Literal translation that Matthew starts his book with, the book of Genesis. Matthew is telling Israel's story. But perhaps as we hear Matthew tell Israel's story, maybe we all have our own Travis Passanita moment. In spite of your best efforts, have the circumstances of life led you to a place you'd rather not go? Has something or someone in your life died at the hands of a power beyond your control? Do you long for God to speak to you in a dream, through a bush, whatever, however he can get you the message to call you home? Do you feel like you can pinpoint exactly where Ramah is in your own life? That place, that action, that event that launched you into exile? Do you long for a king, a ruler, a leader, anyone who can shepherd you from where you are back home? See, Matthew is telling our story. Exile is the dominant experience of humanity. This is what we have been saying since September. We are not at home, and we all feel it. Just the other day, I was at the rec center, and there was a medicine ball there with a message that people working out want to hear. Escape your limits. It's kind of a nice slogan if you're at the gym. Work hard. You can escape your limits. Do it the right way. You can transcend your limits. That's about a 5-pound ball I was working with there. No big deal. But everyone who has lived at least a couple of decades knows there are limits that cannot be escaped. Limits that make us feel trapped, sad, frustrated, not at home. And the Bible explains our sense of exile. The Bible is the only book. Christianity is the only religion that explains it rather than attempts in some way to explain away your sense of exile as an illusion, or if you just were doing the right things, you wouldn't feel it. The Bible explains it. It doesn't explain it away. The first humans sought to exercise their God-given dominion in creation on their terms rather than according to God's wisdom. And the result was exile. God sent humanity out from the garden. The American novelist John Steinbeck famously sums up the human condition with the phrase, east of Eden. We all live east of Eden now, and a cosmic sense of homelessness pervades our lives. Matthew is telling our story. The disobedience that led to humanity's exile from their home in the garden continues and culminates in the expulsion of God's people from the promised land by the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Matthew is telling Israel's story. Matthew is telling our story. Don't you see, our story and Israel's story, it's the same story. The story of humanity is the story of Israel. And while stuck in Babylon with their homes destroyed and their faith and God's power diminishing, God's people asked a crucial question. It's recorded in Psalm 137:4. It's our key verse for this annual focus. They said, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? In other words, what do we do now? What do we do now? And likely soon thereafter, somebody had to ask, and by the way, how do we get out of here? How do we get home? We've all asked those questions. What do I do now? How do I get home? And the answers to those biggest of life's questions lie in yet one more story Matthew is telling. Look at verses 13 through 15 with me. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. That phrase, out of Egypt I called my son, Matthew takes from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And in Hosea 11:1, the son the prophet refers to is clearly Israel. Let me read to you from Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. You don't need a bunch of context clues. It's right there. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Hosea is clearly referring to God's people, Israel, and God's deliverance of his people in the Exodus out of Egypt. Yet in Matthew, the son God calls out of Egypt is Jesus. So what's going on here? It's our third Travis Passanita moment. Matthew is telling Israel's story. Matthew is telling our story. Matthew is telling Jesus' story. What do we do now? How do we get home? Matthew says, let me tell you Jesus' story. And here it is. This is the story of Jesus. Jesus entered into our exile to lead us out of exile. There is a new exodus that is about to take place. This is the clear message of Matthew chapter 2 through chapter 5. This is the run-up to Jesus' ministry, Matthew 2 through 5. And Matthew is trying to show you that Jesus entered into our exile to lead us out by way of a new exodus. It's so clear when I start to say the plot line from 2 to 5, you're going to see it. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, out of Egypt. In Matthew 3:16, Jesus moves through the waters of baptism. In Matthew 4:1, Jesus is sent into the wilderness. And in Matthew 5:1, Jesus goes onto a mountain to deliver his most famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount. Out of Egypt, through the waters, into the wilderness, onto the mountain, Jesus is leading a new exodus. Not just out of Egypt or through the waters of the Red Sea or into the wilderness and onto Mount Sinai to receive the law. Jesus is leading a new exodus, not simply out of Egypt, but out of sin and all of its deathly consequences. Interestingly enough, as Jesus finishes the Sermon on the Mount, he comes down the mountain, and Matthew makes it clear that crowds begin to follow him. This is suggestive of the last move of the Exodus story, out of Egypt, through the waters, into the wilderness, onto the mountain, and into the promised land. It's as if these crowds begin to follow Jesus somewhere being home. Jesus entered into our exile to lead us out of exile. Jesus exchanged the ultimate home in the throne room of God to be a homeless refugee in Egypt. Jesus faces the threat of death at the hands of Herod, but he eventually surrenders to death at the power of hands that are completely in his control. He surrenders all the way to death. Jesus weeps not at Ramah, watching exiles carried off into Babylon, but Jesus weeps as he arrives in Jerusalem, watching exiles refuse his offer to lead them out of exile. And Jesus is the ruler born in Bethlehem who is ready, willing, and able to shepherd the souls of the people all the way home. Matthew tells the story of Israel. Matthew tells our story. Matthew tells Jesus' story. And Jesus' story is this: Jesus entered into our exile to lead us out of exile. Now, have you ever read the story of Exodus and thought, I wish God would do that again? Actually, I don't just wish God would do that again. I wish God would do that in my life. I wish God would do that with this relationship. Place your trust in Jesus Christ now. Put your ultimate hope and faith in him, and a new Exodus journey will begin with Jesus as the leader. You see, as the Lion King is just a shadow of Hamlet. I mean, it's a fine story, but it's no Hamlet. So Moses, as great as he was, is pointing to something even greater. The greater Moses leading the greater and new Exodus. Jesus entered into our exile to lead us out of exile. And so how should we respond? What do we do with not just what Matthew says, but how he presents it to us? I think the application that Matthew envisions is something like this. Learn the story. Learn the story. Out of Egypt, through the waters, into the wilderness, onto the mountain. Learn the beats and the movement of the story so you can begin to recognize them in your own life. In Matthew's birth narrative, which is Matthew chapter 1 through chapter 2, Matthew, interestingly enough, quotes the Old Testament 5 times. If you're taking notes, I'm gonna say this here, so get ready. These are the quotes. 5 times. Matthew 1:23 is 1. Matthew 2:6 is 2. Matthew 2:15 is 3. Matthew 2:18 is 4. And Matthew 2:23 is 5. And 5 is a symbolic number. There are 5 books of Torah in the Bible, 5 books of the law. Torah literally means in Hebrew teaching or instruction. That's why, as Rich said earlier, there are 5 large teaching sections in the book of Matthew that we'll go through in the reading plan during the season of Lent. And what Matthew is doing with those 5 large teaching sections, what he's doing with these 5 quotes from the Old Testament here in the birth narrative, is Matthew is saying, the greater teacher is here. The ultimate instruction is here. See, God's word is not a book. God's word is a person, and that person is Jesus Christ, Matthew says. And so we learn the story. And so I want to really commend to everyone the Bible reading plan this Lent. Let's be a family of faith that's working through the Gospel of Matthew and learning this story of the new Exodus. It's available right there at the welcome tent. It's available online at wcchapel.org/Lent. The more familiar you are with the story of Israel, the more you will understand your story. And the more you will long for the redemption of your story that is available to you in Jesus Christ. And so I hope my friend Travis Pasanita has inspired you this morning. Inspired you to recognize the multiple stories that Matthew is telling, to see where they intersect and overlap. And I pray this Lenten season that we all learn Israel's story to gain greater insight into our own stories, the human story. But most importantly, to place our faith in Jesus Christ, to be taken up into his story. And story's just a metaphor. What really happens is we're taken up into his life, our life, in exchange for his life. We move from in Egypt or in Babylon to being in Christ. He is the long-awaited answer to the question, how do we get home from exile? Jesus enters into our exile to lead us out of exile.
Thank you for joining us today. Here at the Williamsburg Community Chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. So wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we hope you will join us this year as we study the biblical theme of exile and learn how to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land.